So we're going to see how long we can stay in Genesis. Sometimes you get to a point in Genesis, it's hard to come up with a Christmas sermon, in the middle of Genesis. So, but we're going to go at least one more week. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 4 today, and I one of the reasons that I love Genesis, there's lots of reasons, but I do think it helps us to understand what's going on in the world around us. It really goes to human nature, to kind of what sin is, what our relationship with God is, and it's so important because the rest of the Bible kind of fleshes all of this out, right? So last week, we ended with Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden, right? So now they're out of the garden, and basically the rest of the Bible is talking about what do we do now? Because we obviously aren't in the garden, right? Right? That is pretty clear. It's pretty clear we're not in the garden. There's a lot of problems going on. And Genesis chapter 4 kind of shows how sin just starts to snowball. And that's the reality that we're in. And it's one of those things that the church has an interesting relationship with the idea and the concept of sin, right? Sometimes, historically, the church has focused too much on the sin, right? That's all we talk about. You would come into church and you'd just be told how big of a sinner you are, right? There's times we do need to be reminded of that, but after a while, it's just, you're kind of like, okay, I'm done, right? Then there's kind of been the movement to where we go to the other side, where we don't really address sin, because it is uncomfortable, right? And no one likes to be told that they're sinful. But guess what? We all are. We all do things that we shouldn't. And so there's this kind of this balance, but it's important to understand kind of what's behind the sinfulness, right? And because we're all responsible for that. And the irony here is that if we want to find meaning and purpose in our life, guess what keeps us from doing that? Is usually our own sinfulness. So maybe we should be a little bit more open to learning about where this came from, what's kind of driving this. All of us struggle with sin, and we see that here in Genesis chapter 4. So from up to this point, there's basically been three main characters: God, Adam, and Eve, right? So now all of a sudden we start to see more people arrive. So Genesis chapter 4, we'll read through the first few verses and then hit a couple of high points. It says, Adam lay with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought about some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Oh, what the great line. Everyone knows this one. Am I my brother's keeper? All right. The Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened his mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Come, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. But the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The word Nod means wandering. So now Cain is wandering even further from the garden, right? So we're seeing how things are moving away, right? We're moving away from God's original intention. Starts off in the garden. Everything is the way that it should be. Adam and Eve are now outside of the garden, but still kind of in direct presence of God, apparently, right? But now Cain is moving, and so no longer is he going to be in the direct presence of God. But God is still going with him. It's kind of interesting, which is a good point here. So we look at this. I want to first just hit a couple of the things that are going on. This is actually we've talked a lot about science and its relationship with Genesis. Right here it talks about, if you go on, it says, then Cain lay with his wife, and then it goes through this genealogy, and it's been amazing the amount of mental energy that has gone into trying to figure out where did all these other people come from, right? And we don't have a good answer. There's some decent answers. At the beginning, whenever it says God created humankind, he could have created multiple people all at the same time. It could be that Cain is actually with his biological sister, right? Because that's how it would have had to start off, and then it would have continued to spread. The Bible is very clear that now that's not how it should be, but that doesn't mean that at that point. It's funny, we ask those questions of the Bible, and we get really irritated. Right? Well, why didn't the Bible answer those? Ask those questions of science. See what it tells you. It doesn't know either, right? And in fact, if we all came from one single cell that then evolved and then split into other cells, wouldn't someone have been sleeping with their sister at some point? The answer is yes. So I just say that to say sometimes we put more on the Bible and expect more from it, and we just let anything else slide, and we don't ask those critical questions or those questions that kind of make us a little uncomfortable, right? Well, the reality is we don't know for sure, and the reality is it doesn't matter. It really doesn't, right? Because we focus on that, and we miss some really wonderful stuff. So just to get that out of the way, and I love talking about that relationship because it is fascinating to me, the relationship between the Bible and science. But so we look back at the beginning of this story. So we have Adam and Eve having children. It's interesting. Cain is his name is. It's kind of the translation is to bring forth or to create. It's kind of interesting that and Eve names Cain this. It's kind of recognizing, and she even says so. She's recognizing, okay, now I'm part of the creative process, right? And that's how God created the world. He created the world to continue to create, right? And he set this process in motion, and now that is happening. And so you have Cain. And then it says there's Abel. And it's interesting that it doesn't say that Abel was named by Adam and Eve. It just says there's Abel. That actually is kind of like a vapor, the name. It's kind of here today, gone tomorrow, kind of a mist. So it's very reminiscent of what's going to happen. Abel's not going to be on the scene for very long, right? And so it continues on and all jump right into this relationship that humanity has with God, and that they are bringing a sacrifice. We don't know a whole lot about what's going on here, right? Some people have really been critical of God in this and saying, this doesn't really sound fair. How would they know, that one sacrifice would be accepted and one wouldn't be? Well, I think my take on that is one, that God is being fair here, right? And that they would have known the difference. And if you kind of look, Abel brings, the translation there is the choicest, the best part of his flock, to bring. Some people have said this was a matter of bringing a meat sacrifice versus a offering of grain. Well, there actually are offerings of grain throughout the rest of the Bible. That is not an inappropriate offering. What makes it different is the intent behind this, right? And that's where God is looking. Something is clearly different between Abel's bringing of his best to give to God, and Cain kind of just brings some of the fruit that he's prepared, right? There's something obvious about intent here, and so we see that, and so Cain, in the natural way, he gets really angry. right? Because God says, you know what, it's not good enough, right? You more was expected of you. And Cain's response is fairly normal. You get irritated whenever you're told that that's not good enough or you should do more. Nearly all of us, our first response is to get a little defensive on that, right? That is normal. There's nothing wrong with that. When you're told that you've done wrong or that you need to do better, then that's what you're going to feel. You're going to become defensive. The question is, where do you go from there? Right? And so we obviously see that Cain kills Abel, and God has this really interesting conversation with him. And so I want to look at a couple of different aspects of this, and I want to start right after that moment that Cain finds out that his that his offering isn't good enough, because it really gets to the heart of the problem with sin and how sin works within us. And so I think we can all learn quite a bit from this. So what we see is, so Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. So we talked last week about how the root of sin is selfishness, right? That we desire to be in control. The root of the sin that we saw in chapter 3 is selfishness of wanting to be like God, right? So Adam and Eve basically wanted to be like God because they wanted to know the difference between good and evil just like God. They wanted to be able to set their own morality, right? Now we see that selfishness apply to the selfishness that goes between me and you, between humanity, right? That we have this kind of desire in us that we want to be better, right? And whenever we are compared and we do not measure up, it causes major problems. So that's where we see Cain. It says Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. All right, that is not the problem here, right? It's important to know that. That is not a huge deal. The fact that Cain was angry, that what he had done wasn't good, that's not a problem. The problem is where you go from here, and you have two choices. One, you can choose to better yourself. You can choose to be better, right? Or you can just attack the person who got the praise. And you can allow jealousy and bitterness and envy, all of those things to build up within you. And I want you to think about that in terms of our society today, right? In a lot of ways, that can even be encouraged sometimes, right? And how often do you hear that's not fair, so we need to make it fair, right? If there's inequality between two people, many times we look at, well, there's unfairness there. That's what's doing it. Well, maybe, but it could also be that one person is not doing what they need to do, right? It's kind of both of those things. We do need to look at that, right? But the danger here is I think that we can get into a place where we need to recognize that whenever we are tempted in this way, whenever we are told or know that we are lacking, are not measuring up, the wrong direction to go is to attack the people that are measuring up. It's to look at ourselves, right? Now, we may be in systems that are unfair, and all of that may be true, but the only person that you can control is you, right? And we see that from really early on. And then it moves from there. So Cain is angry, and it's interesting that God intervenes right here before Cain has killed Abel, right? So God intervenes. He comes in, he says, hey, what's going on, right? I see that your face is downcast. I see that you are angry. It's interesting that God does not chastise Cain for being angry, right? He doesn't. He says, hey, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? And then God gives I guess maybe because it's God, a pretty good principle here. He says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. All right, this is a really important point. Right? God basically says, hey, if you do what you're supposed to do, then things are going to be okay. If you don't, it can easily lead into a spiral that leads you further and further and further from God. Right? I think sometimes we diminish the importance of our actions. Right? The actions that you take, even sometimes if your intent isn't there, but the actions that you take make a difference, right? And this is shown in many different ways, and people have studied this and looking at this. If you're struggling with being happy, then go out and do something good for someone else, right? It actually makes a difference. It will start to change you, right? Intentionally doing things that you know are inherently good will benefit you, right? They will help you. And that's interesting. I started thinking about this, that so often we're trying and we're struggling to find happiness, we're struggling to find meaning. And one of the ways to do that is to go and do things that are inherently good for other people, right? But a lot of times we have been told that the things that are good are to do what we want to do, right? Just to do what makes you feel good. Here's a simple example, right? We all know that going and visiting people in the nursing home is probably an inherently good thing to do, right? It is not a fun thing to do, right? It's not something anyone wants to do. But there are very few people who, when they finally say, okay, I'm going to do that, even if they do it begrudgingly, and go and do that whenever you finish, you're not like, you know what, that was a good thing to do. Right? And you feel a little bit better. What a lot of us do, myself included, is that I look at a day and I'll say, Netflix has a new series on, and I can watch all 8 episodes in one day. Right? And I have done that. All right? And guess what? In the moment, it was like, this is kind of cool. And then you realize, wait, did anything really good come from that? Now, it's not bad. I'm not telling you that that's a sinful act. Do not hear that. But there's a difference doing things that are only going to kind of benefit ourselves that are not inherently good, right? They don't have a moral component to it, right? And choosing to actually do something good. Doing something good makes a difference, right? If Cain, at this moment, when he heard this from God, if he decided, you know what, I'm going to go and I'm going to find the best crop that is out there, and I'm going to bring this back to God. You know what would have happened? God would have said, thank you, Cain, and Cain would have known, and he would have said, you know what, I've done something inherently good. And guess what? His anger would have dissipated. I can promise you Abel would have still been alive. But he didn't choose that path, did he? Right? And we live in a culture that is constantly pushing us to do the things that make us feel better, right? And those are usually the easier things to do, and they do have some temporary feel-good about them. But it does not lead us to contentment or does not lead us to happiness. It will not help you overcome your anger. Because one thing, whenever I'm frustrated and maybe even, kind of depressed, that has a lot of connotations, but just in one of those moods, what never helps is watching Netflix all day. But what I want to do when I'm in one of those moods is watch Netflix all day. But it doesn't help, right? That's kind of what is getting here at the beginning, that God is saying, hey, man, whenever you feel this way, when you're angry, when you're downcast, go and do something good for someone. Right? Because it'll start to change your perspective, slowly but surely. Right? But Cain does not listen. He says, so God gives the warning, but if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Now, I want to get into that. There's so much to get into with that. That word, but you must master it. It's really interesting. That idea has been talked about in different ways. One way is some have read that is God's promise that Cain will be able to conquer sin, right? So that you will master it. It can also be translated in a way that it's kind of a God's order to us. It's not a promise that you will master sin. It's an order that you must master sin or rule over it. Both of those, I think we can kind of see a little bit here. Some of the Jewish scholars, the way that is probably the most common way to understand this is that you may rule over sin. Basically, it's saying, here's the choice. You can either choose to rule over sin, or you can choose to let it rule over you. And it does come down to that. And whenever we talk about sin, we do need to recognize there is some choice in this. Now, does that mean that there are not those who are more geared towards one sin or another? No. But at some point, we are making choices that can lead us into sinfulness, right? And this is one that we need to wrestle with. And I've talked with people who, like especially with alcoholism and things like that, that there is a disease component to alcoholism, right? But there's also a choice component to alcoholism, right? It is both, right? And I think it is so important, and it should be encouraging to us that we can choose not to sin, right? That's inherent within us. We have been given that choice, right? And we need to remember that. We need to know, hey, I do have the ability to make the right choice, even if I many times don't. So God tells this, he tells Cain, if you don't do what is good, then sin is crouching at your door. I love that image, that it's there, it's ready to pounce and kind of devour, right? And I want to kind of end on this thought process of the danger of sin and where it can lead and how quickly it can kind of get out of control. Because when we start choosing to not do good and to give in to sinfulness, it easily just starts this ball rolling, right? And all of a sudden, what we may have agonized over making a decision that we knew was wrong, it just becomes where we don't even think about it anymore. Right? I don't know if you've seen, and I have binged this movie or show, Breaking Bad. All right. If you haven't seen Breaking Bad, it may not be for you, but it's a fascinating case on human nature. So if you don't know, it's a high school chemistry teacher who has kind of had an unfair things have happened to him. He was a brilliant chemist, was going to be part of a huge company, but he sold out way early on, and now he's teaching high school chemistry, which for a brilliant chemist is not the best thing in the world, right? But he's going on, everything's fine. All of a sudden, he has a wife, an older son, who has some debilities, and now his wife is pregnant, and she's older, and he's probably getting close to 50. He's diagnosed with cancer. And by the way, this is not a true story, so don't feel bad for this guy. So he's diagnosed with cancer. Well, and I mean, they're just basically penny pinching everything. They don't have money. He works at a car wash on the side, right? And now he has cancer. His insurance will cover some basic things, but it won't cover what he needs. It's just all of these things that do happen, right? And we can all empathize with that. So you really feel sorry for this guy. And so his brother is a DEA agent. And brother-in-law, yes, his brother-in-law is a DEA agent. And he goes on a ride along with him, and they bust a meth guy that's making meth. And he finds out kind of how much money is in meth. And then he realizes, I'm a chemist. I can make meth way better than these dropouts, right? And he can. And it's fascinating because what you see is he has great reservations about doing this. You can see it kind of tearing him up. And so he's like, if I can just make a little bit, that'll be enough. And then my family will be able to be taken care of financially, all of this stuff. So he goes out, and it's funny and everything like that, and he makes this meth, and it's the best anyone's ever seen because it's pure. It's made by a chemist, right? And it starts selling. Well, then they have little things that start happening because he needs to make a little bit more, and then the drug dealers start getting involved, and he has these, but you're watching this and you feel really sorry for him, right? You're like, man, I can see how, yeah, it was wrong, but gosh. And he's still struggling with it. He wants to quit, but he can't. And all of a sudden, you get these guys come in that you really hate, and they're threatening, and they beat up a couple of him and his partner, and all of a sudden, one of them is killed. He uses a chemical reaction to knock them out and to basically kill them because they have to save their own life, right? But one of them stays alive, and this is a key point. Because one of them stays alive and they have him in the basement and they don't know what to do. And here's this high school chemistry teacher that now has started making these decisions. And it's like, now what am I going to do with this guy? And this guy is not a good guy. And so you're kind of like, man, yeah, what's one less drug dealer? And he actually takes this guy's life. But you can see it messes with him. It's hard for him. He's like, I know this is wrong, but I've got to do it to save my family, right? And so then the seasons keep coming, and it just, the story continues. By the end, and I believe this is in the last season, his wife knows about everything, and she, he's keep on justifying, keeping on, all of that stuff, and she just yells at him. She's like, I just want the truth. Why are you doing this? He has like piles of money by this time, right? And she's yelling at him, and he just yells back, because I like it. And it's interesting, and all of a sudden, what started off is this guy who was terrified and felt horrible about what he was doing, knew how bad it was. He just kept going and kept going because sin was crouching at his door and it devoured him. And by the end, he was like, I'm still doing it just because I like it. Man, that is how sin works. And none of us are immune from it. That's why making choices is so important. We need to get in the habit of making good choices. Right? Aristotle says this. He says, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. It makes no small difference then whether from habits of one kind or of another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather all the difference, of creating those habits of making the right choice. Because if we don't, it can easily, and this guy was not a bad guy, right? He knew what was right or wrong, but as he made those choices, he became a pretty bad guy, right? And that's where all of us are in danger of that. God is warning Cain. He's like, don't do it. Don't make that step. But Cain does. And it's interesting, God comes back and he asks him, what's going on? And Cain does exactly like we do. Am I my brother's keeper? What was Cain doing there? He was putting that back on God. Right? He was saying, it's your fault. What are you talking about? Am I my brother's keeper? I don't have that responsibility. Right? He's trying to shift blame, just like we saw with Adam and Eve. And God says, nope, I know what you did. And there are consequences to it. But I want you to remember this as we leave. There will be consequences to you making the wrong decision. But God, even with Cain, God promised that, hey, I'm still going to be with you. It's going to be worse because you're farther from my presence. You're walking away from me. But I'm still there. no matter what you've done, no matter how many choices you've gone down the wrong way, you can always stop and allow God to start changing your direction, where you start walking back towards the garden, getting closer to where God desires for you to be. But know how important it is that you choose to do what is good. Not just because it's sinful to do the other, but because it leads to death and depression and frustration. God wants you to do the things that lead to life, that lead to hope, that lead to encouragement, that lead to purpose. And it all comes down to how we decide to go about living. Let's go to him in prayer.